Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but why could someone with a modest formal title sometimes command more real loyalty than someone with a grander one? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because the practical loyalty holding a system together may run less through formal titles than through an informal ledger of reciprocal obligation linking patrons. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. Why could someone with a modest formal title sometimes command more real loyalty than someone with a grander one? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when formal hierarchy can describe official rank while failing to capture the reciprocal personal obligations that actually move favor, protection, and dependable loyalty through the system. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between office-based authority and personalized obligation built through repeated exchange between patrons and clients. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is patron-client network theory as an informal loyalty mechanism, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Patron-client network theory, how protection, favors, resources, and reciprocal obligation can distribute real loyalty through personalized ties that formal hierarchy does not fully capture. The distinction matters here. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. The practical loyalty holding a system together may run less through formal titles than through an informal ledger of reciprocal. The first point is that loyalty is not always stored where formal hierarchy says it should be stored. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Titles can define responsibility publicly, while obligation may still move through private protection, favors, access, and remembered reciprocity. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. That is why a modest office holder with deep client ties can sometimes mobilize more action than a higher official with only formal rank behind them. That is the mechanism. Patron-client networks matter because they bind people through repeated exchange rather than through abstract institutional principle alone. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A patron offers access, advancement, protection, or material help, and the client returns service, support, reputation, and future responsiveness. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. The relationship is therefore personal yet political, because many such ties together can create a second map of power beneath the formal one. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This helps explain why systems often survive apparent institutional weakness through dense personal obligation that keeps coordination moving. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. It also explains why reformers who ignore informal networks can fail quickly, because paper authority does not automatically reassign lived loyalty. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The mechanism is durable when repeated exchange convinces people that the patron relationship remains more reliable than distant formal procedure. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. That durability can strengthen the regime when patronage and formal office align, because informal loyalty then reinforces official structure. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. It can also undermine the regime when patronal loyalty competes with formal command, making office holders dependent on network position, not institutional rule. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This is why patronage should not be reduced to corruption alone. It is an organizing form of reciprocity that can stabilize or distort authority depending on how it nests with institutions. The informal ledger matters because obligations remembered privately can outlast appointments, decrees, and changes of title in visible government. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A wise ruler, therefore, has to understand not only who holds office, but who owes whom, who protects whom, and whose favor actually moves decisions. That is the mechanism. The strategic question is whether personal obligation is supporting the state from below or hollowing out formal hierarchy from inside it. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A fair counterpoint is that some apparently personal loyalty may still depend heavily on the office, wealth, or legal power that gives the patrons something substantial to distribute. The limitation is that the surviving record often captures formal office more than informal reciprocity, making patron-client depth harder to measure precisely. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. The mechanism fails institutionally when personal networks become so dominant that formal offices lose credibility, consistency, and the ability to command beyond factional ties. The limits still matter. There is also an exception in strongly professionalized institutions, where shared role norms can sometimes outweigh personalized obligation for a time. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate because patronage can distribute loyalty while also entrenching favoritism, exclusion, or unequal access. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the pattern remains useful, where people depend on recurring personal exchange more than distant abstract rule. Real loyalty often follows patrons more than titles. The limits still matter. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. A modest title could command more real loyalty when it sat atop stronger reciprocal obligations, because lived support often follows remembered protection and favor more readily than formal rank alone. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. the explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking where real obligation sits, not only where the official chart says it should sit. Ask the structural question. Authority moves through institutions, but it also moves through memory of favors, protection, access, and reciprocal debt. Ask the structural question, look at the institution, remove the ceremonial surface, and the deeper issue becomes whether office commands loyalty directly, or whether loyalty has to travel through patrons first. Ask the structural question. This outcome cannot be reduced to simple corruption because informal obligation can either stabilize official rule or distort it depending on how the layers align. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that real political capacity often lives where formal hierarchy and informal loyalty intersect. Ask the structural question. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether informal reciprocal loyalty is reinforcing the formal state or quietly replacing it with a second map of power beneath official rank. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.